According to IPCC AR6, what is the key certainty statement about human influence? It is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. What global temperature anomaly above pre-industrial does the review cite? It reports 1.46 C above the pre-industrial average. What global temperature anomaly above the 20th century average does the review cite? It reports 1.29 C above the 20th century average. What base period are the temperature graphs in the review referenced to? They are referenced to the 1951 to 1980 base period. What warming level does the review describe as the widely accepted upper limit, limiting warming to 1.50 C above pre-industrial levels? In the review, how does methane radiative forcing compare to CO2 forcing alone? Methane adds about 50% additional forcing beyond carbon dioxide alone. When did atmospheric methane begin accelerating again? According to the review, it began accelerating starting in 2007. What two major sources are debated for the methane increase since 2007? Animal agriculture and natural gas extraction and transport. Which methane source does the review say is probably the primary cause? Since 2007, natural gas extraction and transport is probably the primary cause. What does the review emphasize about methane leaks from natural gas systems? Small leaks and emissions of methane matter for warming. What did Howarth 2011 argue about natural gas versus coal? When methane leaks are included, natural gas warming can be as bad or worse than burning coal. What question style does the review imply about methane versus CO2 forcing? No relative contributions and direction rather than exact decimals. What did the National Academy of Science 2021 report outline? It outlined a pathway to net zero emissions. What benefits does the review list for policies that reach net zero? They produce cleaner energy, high-quality jobs, and improved competitiveness. What warning does the NAS 2021 report give about achieving net zero? It requires heavy political lifting by Congress and future administrations. In the IEA 2023 roadmap, what share of emissions cuts to 2050 comes from carbon capture? Carbon capture is about 8% of the total cuts to 2050. What total CO2 capture scale to 2050 does the review associate with that 8% share? About 1 billion tons of CO2 would need to be captured. How much CO2 do industrial firms capture per year today in the review? About 45 million tons per year. Why does the review say current carbon capture is not enough? Current capture is far below the roughly 1 billion tons needed. What is green hydrogen in the review? Hydrogen made by electrolysis of water using renewable energy. What is blue hydrogen in the review? Hydrogen made from methane obtained from natural gas fracking. Why does the review treat blue hydrogen as a mistake even if renewables power separation? It remains tied to methane and natural gas extraction impacts. At COP21, what are national pledges called in UN jargon? Per the review, they are intended nationally determined contributions or INDCs. What fraction of global emissions were covered by COP21 INDC pledges? They covered nations responsible for about 90% of global emissions. What warming level would COP21 pledges lead to? According to the review, about 2.70 C to 30 C of warming. What review mechanism was built into the Paris Agreement to strengthen pledges? Targets are reviewed every 5 years to ratchet downward. Which clean energy option does the review highlight as cheaper to deploy? Solar is highlighted as cheaper to deploy. What organization regulates deep sea mining exploration contracts in the review? The International Seabed Authority, or ISA. How many exploration contracts has the ISA approved since 1994? It has approved over 24 exploration contracts. How long can ISA contractors explore their claim areas? They can explore for up to 15 years. What is the average annual U.S. loss from billion-dollar disasters over the last decade in the review? It averages about $140 billion per year. What total U.S. loss over the decade does the review report for billion-dollar disasters? It totals about $1.4 trillion for the decade. What did IPCC AR5 conclude about anthropogenic forcing and temperature extremes? It was very likely to have contributed to changes since the mid-20th century. What does IPCC AR6 call the link between human emissions and some extremes? It calls it an established fact for increased frequency and/or intensity. What does the review say is a major advance in extreme weather attribution? Since 2013, scientists can quantify climate change roles in specific events. When do attribution scientists increasingly produce estimates according to the review, while a disaster is still fresh in people's minds? In the review, what holds the polar jet stream at high latitudes? A strong north-south atmospheric pressure gradient holds it. In the review, what is the pressure gradient proportional to? It is proportional to the temperature difference across the jet. For 10-year heatwave events, how does frequency change at 1.50 C warming? It increases about 4.1 times. For 10-year heatwave events, how does frequency change at 20 C warming? It increases about 5.6 times, or about every 2 years. For 50-year heatwave events, how does frequency change at 1.50 C warming? It increases about 8.6 times, or about every 6 years. For 50-year heatwave events, how does frequency change at 20 C warming? It increases about 13.9 times, or about every 4 years. With business as usual emissions, what global mean sea level rise by 2100 does the review expect? About 1 meter by the end of the century. What does the review say about the timing of that 1 meter sea level rise? Some models suggest it could be reached much sooner. According to IPCC AR6, what is the long-term commitment of sea level rise? Sea level is committed to rise for hundreds to thousands of years. Over the next 2,000 years, how much sea level rise is projected if warming is limited to 1.50 C, about 2 to 3 meters? Over the next 2,000 years, how much sea level rise is projected if warming is limited to 20 C, about 2 to 6 meters? Over the next 2,000 years, how much sea level rise is projected if warming reaches 50 C, about 19 to 22 meters? What 3 broad coastal response strategies appear in the review? Retreat, accommodate, and protect. What does the review say about temperature trends in East Antarctica? Some stations show some cooling. What does the review say about overall temperature trends in Antarctica? In general, Antarctica is warming up. Why is the West Antarctic ice sheet losing mass? According to the review, warmer ocean water near the coast is driving loss. How much ice sheet volume has West Antarctica lost over the last 2 decades? Per the review, about 18% of its ice sheet volume. Under 20 C warming, what is the chance and timing for a first ice-free Arctic summer? Per the review, there is about a 1 in 5 chance in 2035. In the review, what percent have Cornell net CO2 emissions been reduced since 2008? Net CO2 emissions are reduced by 36% since 2008. In the review, what factor caused the biggest drop in Cornell emissions? A reduction in purchased electricity caused the biggest drop. In the review, what emission component remains stubbornly constant? Heat and power emissions remain stubbornly constant. What does the review say methane leaked upstream could do to Cornell emissions? 160k metric tons. CO2 equivalents could come close to doubling emissions. What CO2 equivalent does the review give for upstream methane using GWP20? It gives about 160k metric tons CO2 equivalents. What CO2 equivalent does the review give for upstream methane using GWP100? It gives about 50k metric tons CO2 equivalents. What drill depth does the review report for the Cornell University Borehole Observatory? It reports a 2-mile or 3.2 km drill depth. What temperature range at depth does the review report for CUBO? It reports about 75 OC to 100 OC at depth. What does the review say about native rock permeability at CUBO depth? It is low. What method does the review say will be needed to enhance permeability for Earth source heat? Hydraulic fracturing will be needed. What does the review say tests elsewhere show about increasing permeability? Permeability can be increased safely and responsibly to create pathways. According to the review, what two rock layers show promise for Earth source heat near Cornell? A colder shale layer and a hotter basement layer show promise. In the review, what is a key trade-off of the colder shale layer? It has well understood fractures but is hard to drill horizontally. In the review, what is a key trade-off of the hotter basement rock layer? It is easier to drill horizontally but has riskier complex fracture patterns. What is point source pollution in the review? A singular identifiable source such as an industrial discharge or sewage outfall pipe. What is non-point source pollution in the review? A diffuse source moved by rainfall over and through the ground into waters. Give one example of non-point source pollution from urban areas in the review. Oil and toxic chemicals runoff from urban roadways. Give one example of non-point source pollution from agriculture or lawns in the review. Excess fertilizers, herbicides, and insecticides runoff from fields and residential areas. Give one example of non-point source pollution from waste systems in the review. Bacteria and nutrients from livestock and faulty septic systems. Give one example of non-point source pollution from land use and mining in the review. Salt from irrigation and acid drainage from abandoned mines. What atmospheric pathway is listed as a non-point source pollutant in the review? Atmospheric deposition such as acid rain. What does the review say about oil in Wild Harbor Marsh? Decades after a spill, oil was still present at toxic levels 40 years later. What type of pollution source is a sewage outfall pipe in the review? It is a point source discharge. What three big concerns about microplastics are listed in the review? They are eaten by plankton, carry adsorbed organics, and are eaten by corals, impacting reefs. How can microplastics move through the marine food chain? According to the review, they can be consumed by zooplankton and moved up the food chain. What can microplastics do on their surface? According to the review, they can adsorb potentially toxic organic compounds. What coral-related concern about microplastics is listed in the review? They can be consumed by corals and may impact reef systems. When did the INC for a plastic pollution treaty begin? According to the review, it began in 2022. When and where was the INC 5 session held? According to the review, it was held in November and December 2024. When and where was the INC 5.2 follow-up held? According to the review, it was held in Geneva in August 2025. What was the outcome of the Geneva INC 5.2 talks? In the review, talks adjourned without consensus on a treaty text. How does the EPA define nutrient pollution in the review? It is excess nitrogen and phosphorus in air and water, and is widespread and costly. In the review, what is the basic first step of high nutrient loading in coastal waters? More nutrients stimulate exceptional algal growth. In the review, what ultimately causes hypoxic or anoxic bottom waters under high nutrient loading? Microbial consumption of sinking algae consumes oxygen and draws it down. What percent worldwide decline in top predator fish since the 1960s is cited in the review? It cites a 90% decline in top predator fish. What proxy indicator for fish abundance does the review use in the Myers and Worm graph? Catch per 100 hook set is used as a proxy for abundance. How large are global fisheries subsidies per year in the review? They are about $35 billion per year. Why does the review say many high seas fisheries would not be viable without subsidies? Because subsidies make otherwise uneconomic fishing profitable. Name one harmful subsidy category listed in the review. Cheap fuel is a key harmful subsidy. What fishing practice might almost certainly stop without fuel subsidy? According to the review, bottom trawling would almost certainly stop. In the review, how much of sea life scraped up by trawlers is undesirable and discarded? As much as 70% is undesirable and discarded. In the review, how does the annual area affected by trawling compare to global forest clearing? Trawling affects an area about 150 times greater each year. In the review, what fraction of the world's tuna is caught using fads? About 50% of the world's tuna is caught using fads. How many fads are deployed each year? According to the review, about 100,000 fads are deployed each year. How do fads affect bycatch relative to nets on free swimming schools? In the review, they increase bycatch by about 500 to 1,000%. In the review, what percent of a fad-associated skipjack sen catch can be juvenile yellowfin and bigeye? About 15 to 20%. What type of fishing gear length does the review give for longline fishing? Longlines often stretch more than 100 kilometers. Which non-target animals does the review say longline fishing unintentionally catches? It catches seabirds, turtles, and sharks. What does the review say about albatross species at risk of extinction and longline fishing? All 21 albatross species are now at risk largely due to longline fishing. What does the review say makes sharks vulnerable to overfishing? They have slow growth and reproductive rates. What worldwide loss of sharks and rays does the review cite? It cites about a 70% worldwide loss. According to the review, what regulation works better than finning bans for sharks? Full shark fishing bans reduce mortality by nearly 40%. How many species have been identified and described so far? According to the review, about 1.3 to 1.8 million species have been identified and described. What total species estimate does the review cite for Earth? It cites a best estimate of about 8.7 million plant and animal species. What are ecosystem services in the review? In one idea, they are benefits from nature that support human well-being. Give one ecosystem service example stated in the review. Primary producers make the oxygen you breathe. When was the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development adopted per the review? It was adopted by all UN member states in 2015. How many sustainable development goals are in the 2030 Agenda per the review? There are 17 SDGs. What does the review say is central to achieving many SDGs? A healthy, stable natural world sustained by high biodiversity. What does the review call IPBES? It is like the IPCC but for biodiversity. How many species does the IPBES 2019 report say are threatened with extinction? Nearly 1 million species are threatened with extinction. List the 5 direct drivers of change in nature ranked in the IPBES report: land and sea use change, direct exploitation, climate change, pollution, and invasive alien species. What fraction of critical marine habitats like seagrass, mangroves, and coral reefs has already been destroyed per the review? About 30 to 35% has already been destroyed. Without significant changes, what does the review say could happen to marine species by 2100? More than half of marine species may be on the brink of extinction by 2100. What protection scale does the review argue is needed by 2050 with an interim target by 2030? Protect half the planet by 2050 with 30% protected by 2030. What does the review say individuals can do first to help biodiversity? Vote and reduce high-impact consumption such as beef and unsustainable palm oil products. What does the review say about the status of the 6th mass extinction? It says it is very likely now underway. Which ocean species groups does the review say will be especially affected in a 6th mass extinction? Large vertebrates and reef species are especially at risk. How fast does the review say the 6th mass extinction would unfold geologically? It would occur very quickly in hundreds to thousands of years. What kinds of consequences does the review warn the 6th mass extinction would have? It would have unpredictable ecological, environmental, and evolutionary consequences. According to the review, when might the 6th mass extinction have begun on land? It may have begun thousands of years ago. According to the review, what is a key timing message for the oceans? Only recently has the 6th mass extinction reached the oceans. In U.S. jurisdictional regions, how far offshore do most state governments manage resources, from the shoreline to 3 miles offshore? Which U.S. regions have state jurisdiction extending to 9 miles in the review? Texas and the Gulf Coast of Florida. In U.S. jurisdictional regions, how far offshore does the federal government manage resources, from 3 miles offshore to 200 miles offshore? What are international waters beyond 200 miles called in the review? They are the high seas. Under the Clean Water Act, what must point source discharges obtain? They must obtain an NPDES permit. Under the Clean Water Act, what level of treatment is required for publicly owned sewage facilities? They must be secondary treatment facilities or better. What does the review say happened to Clean Water Act protections after Sackett v. EPA in 2023? Protections were reduced again after the Supreme Court ruling. What is the governing authority for fishery management in U.S. federal waters in the review? The Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act. What key zone did the Magnuson-Stevens Act establish in the review? A 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. What agency did the Magnuson-Stevens Act establish as lead for fisheries management? The National Marine Fisheries Service within NOAA. What act established a moratorium on taking and importing marine mammals with exceptions? The Federal Marine Mammal Protection Act. According to the review, what does UNCLOS establish for maritime nations? It establishes a 200-mile exclusive economic zone for all maritime nations. What did world governments agree to in March 2023 per the review? They agreed to the UN High Seas Treaty for conservation beyond territorial waters. Why does the review say the High Seas Treaty is critical for the 30 by 30 goal? Without it, there was no legal mechanism to set MPAs on the high seas. In the review, what 3 needs must sustainability balance environmental protection, economic development, and social justice across generations? In ecology, how does the review define sustainability? It is how biological systems remain diverse and productive over time. For humans, how does the review describe sustainability? It is long-term maintenance of well-being that depends on a healthy natural world. How does the review define sustainable development? Meeting present needs without compromising future generations' ability to meet theirs. What does the review say the global ecological footprint equals today? Humanity uses about 1.5 to 1.8 planet Earth's worth of resources. What does the review say that implies about annual resource use? We consume about 80% more than Earth can replenish each year. If trends continue, what does the review project for 2040 ecological footprint? We would need 2 Earths to support humanity. What lesson from past civilizations does the review emphasize? They collapsed by overexploiting surroundings and sacrificing sustainability to the present. According to the review, what are the only barriers holding us back from climate action, social action, and courageous leadership? In the review, what scale of coordinated action is needed to decarbonize? Government action on a scale as grand as WWII mobilization. In aquaculture, what is the key difference between fed and unfed systems? Fed aquaculture grows finfish that require external feed and produce waste, while unfed aquaculture grows shellfish or seaweed that rely on natural food sources. Which aquaculture type is generally more sustainable in the review, and why unfed aquaculture is generally more sustainable? Because it does not require wild fish feed inputs. What is the main sustainability problem with fed finfish aquaculture? Fed finfish aquaculture often depends on feed made from wild-caught fish and can concentrate waste pollution. What is the main sustainability advantage of farming mussels and oysters? They filter feed on natural plankton, so they require no external fish feed. What is the main sustainability advantage of seaweed aquaculture? Seaweed uses sunlight and dissolved nutrients, so it requires no external feed inputs. About what share of global fish production does aquaculture provide in the review? The review states aquaculture is about 49% of global fish production. By about what year does the review project most seafood could be farm-raised, and what fraction? By 2030, the review projects about 62% of seafood could be farm-raised. In the review, what fraction of total wild seafood catch is forage fish? Forage fish are about 40% of the total wild seafood catch. In the review, what fraction of forage fish is used to feed aquaculture? The review states aquaculture uses about 75% of forage fish. In the review, when are we predicted to reach the limit of wild-caught forage fish under business as usual? The review projects the limit could be reached by 2037. Why are forage fish a keystone resource in marine food webs? Forage fish support higher trophic levels such as seabirds, marine mammals, and top predator fish. What is a major coastal ecosystem impact linked to shrimp farming? Shrimp farming is a major driver of mangrove forest destruction in tropical nations. Why is antibiotic use in aquaculture a public health concern? Large-scale antibiotic use can promote antibiotic-resistant bacteria, which best describes a common waste problem from intensive finfish farming. High nutrient and organic wastes can concentrate locally and degrade water quality. Primary sewage treatment means what process? Primary treatment removes solids mainly by settling to form sludge. Secondary sewage treatment removes what and how? Secondary treatment removes dissolved organics using oxygen and microbes. Which sewage treatment level is required for publicly owned facilities in the U.S.? Per the review, secondary treatment is required for publicly owned sewage facilities in the U.S. Tertiary sewage treatment targets what key pollutants? Tertiary treatment removes plant nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus to prevent eutrophication. Why does tertiary treatment help prevent dead zones? Reducing nitrogen and phosphorus limits algal blooms that later drive oxygen loss. In biomagnification, what happens to mercury concentrations up the food chain? Concentrations increase strongly with trophic level because mercury is not easily metabolized or lost. What order of magnitude increase does the review give for mercury from phytoplankton to top predators? The review cites about a 10^5 or 100,000 times increase. Why do heavy metals biomagnify more than carbon-based food energy? Heavy metals are retained in tissues rather than being burned for energy, so they accumulate. What key ecological shift did the review cite during the blob marine heatwave? Zooplankton shifted towards smaller, less nutritious species compared with lipid-rich copepods. What major seabird impact did the review cite during the blob event? Seabirds experienced massive die-offs as food became harder to find. Why can marine heatwaves disrupt food webs quickly? They change species composition and energy availability across trophic levels. How did the Deepwater Horizon spill compare in size to the Exxon Valdez in the review? The review states Deepwater Horizon was about 5 times bigger than Exxon Valdez. What long-term trend in Antarctic krill does the review cite? Krill populations declined by about 70 to 80% over the last 40 years. Why do krill declines matter for higher predators? Krill are a foundational prey resource for many southern ocean animals. What comparison does the review give for beef water footprint versus vegetables? Beef is about 4 million gallons of water per ton versus about 85,000 gallons per ton for vegetables. In the IPCC developing versus developed emissions projection, what is the key comparison? Developing countries are projected to emit about twice the cumulative emissions of developed countries over the next 100 years. According to the review, what share of major world fisheries are maximally exploited or overfished? About 93% of major world fisheries are maximally exploited or overfished. How did the fraction of overfished stocks change from 1975 to 2019? In the review, overfished stocks rose from about 10% in 1975 to about 43% by 2019. Why are fisheries subsidy statistics exam worthy in this course? They support single best answer questions about dominant drivers of overfishing pressure.